Today we're in an early model JK with a LS engine. I'm not exactly sure what it is. It's a 6.2 I believe, but it's been cammed. It's got a 6L80 with a high stall converter. It's really rumpity rump. That vehicle in front of me is a Genrite Jeep with an LT1 8-speed, and it couldn't be more different than what I'm driving. What I'm driving is radical, it's loud, it's rumpity rump. Let's just say it has a lot of drama. That Jeep with the 8-speed is as mild as can be. Idles at 400 to 500 RPM, has massive torque right off the line. Now this engine's got some power, but most of it's on the top end, so the bottom end's pretty soft. Okay? You really don't feel the power until about 4,000 RPM, and then it starts pulling, where the LT1 starts pulling right off idle, and probably at about 4,000 or 5,000 RPM the power starts dropping off. So they're exactly the opposite. This is how we used to build power in the old days. Power is really determined by how much air-fuel mixture you can burn in the combustion chamber, and we can get volumetric efficiency in these old engines above 100%, and the camshaft's a big part of that, because by allowing the intake valve to close late, you can take advantage of the ram effect of the air going into the cylinder and actually compress that air to where you can run 105%, maybe even a little bit more. You remember the old Can-Am cars with the stacks? That's exactly what they were doing. The thing is you were building horsepower at a specific RPM, and that's high RPM. With the LT1, it's completely the opposite. We're building horsepower with high compression. The LT1 and the L86 are about 11.5 to 1, and the way they tame it is with that continuous variable valve timing. So we can advance the cam when we want cylinder pressure to increase, and we can retard the cam when we want the cylinder pressure to go down. What we have here in this Jeep, and you can see even on the converter we're at about 800-900 RPM, almost double what that Jeep is in front of us. For a cam Jeep, this thing really doesn't run too bad. It just brings back memories of driving through underground parking lots in Brentwood and listening to all the car alarms go off. Now this Jeep's got a loose converter, so we can build trans temp up quickly, because the converter has to be there. It's a fluid coupling between the engine and transmission. And if you imagine a clutch, if you were to come to a stop with the clutch out, it would just stall the engine if you're not in neutral. So the fluid coupling allows you to come to a stop and allow the engine to idle, which the automatic transmission requires. But that slippage can be an enemy when it comes to friction and fuel economy. Now with a big cam, because the bottom end is pretty soft, we have to loosen that converter up. And this has a high stall converter in it. I don't know how much, maybe 2,600, 2,800 RPM. I can feel it. You get on it and the engine basically revs up. It feels really similar to that, and yeah, it'll pass anything but a gas station. You get on it and you feel the engine rev up. It feels similar to that LS7 we had in recently, where you really build that RPM up and then the thing launches. It's kind of like a rubber band effect. Again, it's completely opposite of the LT1, and I'm sorry if you guys can't hear me. The LT1, on the other hand, you give it throttle, it's like a diesel, it just pulls. You don't hear very much, you just go. So we all know that Detroit got away from the big cammed engines in the late 60s, early 70s, and there was a lot of reasons for that. The main principal reason was emissions, just run dirty, and there's nothing you can do about it when, at low RPM, when you have raw hydrocarbons and carbon monoxide coming out the exhaust, there's just not a lot you can do to clean it up. I was a smog technician for a lot of years, a diagnostic technician, and I remember trying to get these cammed engines to pass smog, and it's tough. So we had to get away from that. Another thing was engines were getting really powerful. I have a 1970 Chevelle that's rated at 450 horsepower. It's an LS6. And the chassis, in a lot of ways, weren't up to it. I remember my 66 Chevelle, 396 horse, and it had a single master cylinder. So let me get off the throttle here so I can hear myself. So having 4-drum brakes and a single master cylinder in a car with 375 horsepower was kind of nuts. So it was a safety thing. Now today's cars are much better. As you know, we have electronic stability program to help you keep the car on the road. And the chassis and the brakes are power output. Now we have an airbag light on because this vehicle has aftermarket seats, and the airbag or the seat sensors aren't plugged in. The ABS light's on. I don't know why it's not communicating. The module's not communicating with the network. And this vehicle wasn't built by Motec. It was built back east, I think in Florida. And that's just how we got it. So we're going to diagnose why it's not talking. It could be a network configuration error. It could be a module failure. It could be wiring. Who knows? But that's really all that's wrong with it at this point, and we'll get that quickly sorted. Now, we did have to go through a few steps to get this thing to run right. The transmission cooler on this, as I mentioned, that loose converter, and we're pushing, this vehicle doesn't have the temp on the dash right now, but we're pushing 110 right now in Vegas. So we're in a black Jeep with large tires and a reduced inlet grill. And when you guys see the grill on this, you'll know what I'm talking about. The customer is gonna put the original grill back on, an original Jeep grill, which is gonna help. But we are running pretty cool now. We added a rail cooler, and one of the big problems with this transmission was they had a relatively large transmission cooler on it, but it was mounted below the bumper, so it was just hanging out in the breeze. And these transmissions build a lot of heat up when you come to a stop, because that's when you have a lot of friction, because torque converter slippage is at its maximum. So I would just sit here at an idle and watch that trans temp rise 150, 160, 200, 210, 220, and there was no airflow going to the transmission cooler. So we relocated the transmission cooler to in front of the condenser, and then we put a rail cooler on. And as you can see, we're doing a lot better. It's 186 right now, which it's 110 out. It's black and we're in traffic. So we're gonna see, we might even add a third cooler, I'm not sure yet. But you guys gotta take care of the coolant system. It wasn't so much an issue a few months ago, but it's an issue now. When you have the reduced size grill, large tires, oh, and look, our speedometer dropped out. And that was one of the complaints the customer had. And that probably has to do with the ABS module, because the ABS module is responsible for picking up the four-wheel speed sensors and then averaging it and putting it on the CAN network. So we definitely have a problem with the ABS system on this vehicle. Now, this vehicle had a frame off, and they powder coated the frame and changed the axles, and I don't know what they did with the axles. It's had a lot of mods done to it. So we're just gonna have to get in there and see what's going on with that ABS module. So as usual, the bottom line comes down to, what do you want? If you want something that's loud and obnoxious and pretentious, then this is a pretty cool Jeep. If you want something that's really mild and conservative but still has equal power, then look no further than the LT1. Remember, when you get a cam like this, and I don't know what heads are on there, so none of that, but be willing to spend some money on tuning to get it right. This one's not too bad. I've had them that are really bad, really off. This one actually runs pretty decent, other than it's quite radical. I think we're all hurting right now because of the price of gas. We're well over $5 here in Vegas, and driving these Jeeps, and you know, I'm getting 16 miles to the gallon in an LT, which isn't bad, but still, when it costs you over $100 to fill up a tank, that hurts. Something like this, I'm not going to expect to get great gas mileage. All right, so it's easier to talk when we come to a stop. So when it comes to engine modifications, and I've been getting this a lot lately, where a guy will send in a build and they'll say, hey, you know, put a cam in it and tune it. We don't really like to do that. We like to keep stuff as stock and original as possible, including the tunes, not only for emissions, but when you go with a stock GM tune, you know that all the safeties are built in, all the failure modes, hot protection, all that stuff. I just talked to a guy in Texas, and he had a guy tune his 5.3 in his Silverado, and he says been nothing but problems, overheating, and he ended up having some failures, mechanical failures. And I told him, look, instead of getting a 5.3 and pimping it out, get yourself a 6.0 or a 6.2. You'll have the same horsepower, you'll have a stock tune, be reliable. So let's talk about engine mods. We're not big on engine mods. We say buy the horsepower you want. Now, there's really two categories here. There's the LS, then there's the LT, because they do build power in different ways. And the LT is just kind of on a different level than everything else. When you consider the LT has the direct injection, high compression, CVVT, there's a lot you can do with that to make power. So here's my advice. Buy the power you want. You want 430 horsepower in an LS, get the LS3. Don't get a 6-liter and cam it and put heads on it. You're going to spend more money and have more grief, and at the end of the day, you're just not going to be happy. If a 5.3 will work for you, you have a light JK, it's on smaller tires, get the 5.3. But if you want more power than the 5.3 puts out, don't buy a 5.3 and cam it. That's my opinion. When it comes to the LT, the rules kind of change, because even a little 5.3 LT puts out really good torque. So you can kind of have your cake and eat it too. You can have an engine that's very mild, that runs on regular gas, that gets reasonable fuel economy, but still is very powerful. And I gotta say, some of these new 5.3s, I was driving an L82 the other day, are very impressive with how much power they put out for their size. So when it comes to engine modifications, I recommend that you keep them to a minimum. Sure, you want to go to a higher flow air filter or some really minor mod, maybe a little bit of tweaking on the tune, add a little bit of spark to it, whatever, that's fine. But once you start getting into the mechanical modifications, you either really got to know what you're doing or just don't do it. Because when you take a factory powertrain with a factory calibration, it has to cover a lot of bases. It has to be emissions compliant. It has to be safe. It has to have longevity. It has to have good power. It has to operate in different environments. I go to Heber, where it was snowing just a few weeks ago, to now in Vegas, and it's 110 degrees out. So while one tune might be maximized for the hot temperatures, it may not be optimized for the cold temperatures. And that's what the factory tune does, is it tries to cover all the bases. It also tries to keep your engine safe, because these manufacturers don't want to warranty your engine. So you got all sorts of protection modes. You have all sorts of failure modes. This week alone, I've had 2 guys call me and say that their fans were shutting down because it's pretty much hot all around the Southwest. And they had tuners go in and crank their fan percentage up to where the fan entered a diagnostic mode and shut down. So the manufacturers maximize everything. To gain something, you're probably going to lose something else. You might gain some power, but you might lose economy. You might get power, and you might lose drivability. It's always a trade-off. So what you're going to get from us is a stock powertrain and a stock tune. And at the end of the day, that's probably going to be what you're most happy with. One of the great things about the modern powertrains, and it's not just from GM, it's pretty much from all the manufacturers now, is we're not sacrificing a lot in horsepower, but we're gaining drivability, we're gaining economy, we're gaining lower emissions, and there really is no downside. Is there a place for something like this? Of course there is. There's a lot of guys out there that like cammed engine. There's a lot of guys out there that like manual transmissions. It all comes down to what you want, what your need is. Now, I was one of these guys. I used to get horsepower through cams and headers and all that. But now we have some legitimate alternatives. I remember when fuel injection came out and we started to phase out the carburetors. That was huge. Then roller cams became the thing. Everything was an incremental improvement. And now we end up with an engine that you can run on pump gas that's 11.5 to 1 compression ratio. That was unheard of 30 years ago, 20 years ago. So we're going to take this cam LS JK out to the mountain tomorrow, and we got a lot of stuff coming up, so stay tuned.